A 16-year-old boy was handcuffed, humiliated, and thrown into the system for a crime he didn't commit. But when he walked into that courtroom, he did something no one expected. He turned the whole case upside down. Carlos Ramirez wasn't in a hurry. The way to school was familiar to him. A 15-minute journey along cracked sidewalks and worn facades. It was early. The sun barely pierced through the gray and cloudy sky. His backpack hanging over one shoulder felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the upcoming debate competition, or perhaps the history exam for which he had been studying all night. Anyway, today was just another day until it stopped being one. The sharp sound of the sirens pulled him out of his thoughts. Go ahead. Flashing red and blue lights painted the pavement, bouncing off the glass windows of a corner hardware store. Carlos slowed his pace, adjusting his hoodie as he watched the commotion. A broken window, yellow tape being put up, an officer talking to the store owner. Then he heard the voice, "Hands where I can see them." Carlos barely had time to process before a police officer lunged at him with his hand already resting on his holster. Sergeant Bennett, the name was familiar to him. The people in the neighborhood knew him, not for protecting, but for harassing. Carlos's hands instinctively rose, his heart hammering. What's happening? His voice was firm, but the question hung in the air like a challenge. Bennett didn't respond. He grabbed Carlos's wrist, pulling it back with a force that sent pain shooting up to his shoulder. The other hand remained locked in cold steel. The handcuffs were too tight. "We have him," Bennett barked into his radio. "Do you have whom?" Carlos's voice broke as reality began to sink in. "Don't play dumb," Bennett murmured. "The security cameras place you near the store when it was attacked. You match the description." Carlos's mind was racing. The description. What description? He had just been walking. He hadn't even been near the store. "Sir, I didn't do anything," Bennett scoffed. "Oh yeah, dark sweatshirt, sneakers, young Latino." And there he was. A small crowd had begun to gather. People were slowing down their cars. Some took out their phones, but no one stepped forward. Carlos's heart was pounding as the officer pushed him towards the patrol car. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But when the cold door closed behind him and the realization sank in, Carlos knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. But the nightmare was just beginning. The patrol car smelled of sweat and old leather. Carlos sat, rigidly with his wrists still cuffed behind him. Every little movement made the handcuffs dig deeper into his skin. I wanted to scream, tell them to check the cameras, to really look at the footage, but I knew it was better not to. The trip to the police station was short, but it felt like an eternity. The officer in front, one he didn't recognize, barely spoke. When they arrived, Carlos was yanked out of the car. His backpack was left behind, inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed above his head. The room was cold, the kind of cold that not only seeps into your skin, but settles into your bones. The first thing they took was his name, then his fingerprints, then his shoelaces, as if he were a criminal about to throw his life away. A tired-eyed police officer sat him down in a metal chair. "Your mom has been called." His voice was flat, as if this were just another formality, just another child being processed. Carlos swallowed the lump in his throat. His mother, Elena Ramirez, a single mother, worked 2 jobs. The hardest-working woman he knew, the only person he couldn't stand to see, worried. The minutes dragged on. Then an hour, then another, and finally the heavy door swung open and Elena stormed in. Her eyes fixed on Carlos, searching for him, checking for any signs of harm. But when he turned to the officer, his voice was pure. "Fire! Where is your lawyer? What is he even being accused of?" Sergeant Bennett walked into the room with his arms crossed, his badge practically shining under the lights. "We have surveillance footage placing him near the crime scene." A store was broken into, stolen tools, damages. Matches the suspect's description. Elena's nostrils flared. And that description is a dark sweatshirt, sneakers. Carlos observed as his mother clenched her jaw. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. My son was walking to school. Bennett shrugged. That's what you say. The rage in Elena's eyes could have burned the walls, but rage wasn't going to free Carlos. A man in a wrinkled suit finally walked in, glancing at a folder as if he had just reviewed Carlos's case for the first time. In the hallway, the public defender barely looked at Carlos. They are offering a plea deal. Elena's head turned towards him. A what? The lawyer exhaled, clearly exhausted. If he pleads guilty, he can avoid a trial. Probation, community service. It's the best option. Carlos's stomach dropped. Better option. Plead guilty to something you didn't do. Just like that. His mother's voice was steel. We're not going to sign anything. The lawyer sighed as if he had heard all this before. I understand, Mrs. Ramirez, but these cases usually don't end well. It's your word against that of a police officer. A trial could mean. Elena interrupted him. Carlos's fingers curled into fists. His mother was right. They weren't going to accept this just like that. But what scared him wasn't just the system working against him, it was the way everyone in the room had already decided his fate. But Carlos wasn't going to let them decide his future for him. Carlos barely slept that night. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment from the precinct. The handcuffs, the way Bennett smiled smugly when he talked to her mother, the public defender pushing that plea deal, as if it were the only way out. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just a kid. But even he knew that something was wrong. In the morning, his decision was made. If no one else was going to fight for him, he would fight for himself. At school, he skipped lunch and went straight to the library. The legal section wasn't large, mainly outdated textbooks and reference materials, but it was all he had. He grabbed a thick book titled Criminal Procedure and flipped through the pages looking for anything that could help him understand his situation. He started with the basics. Burden of proof. The prosecution had to prove that he was guilty, not the other way around. Chain of custody. If the police didn't handle the evidence correctly, it could be discarded. Credibility of witnesses. The word of a police officer carried weight, but inconsistencies could shatter his testimony. The more he read, the clearer things became. They had nothing against him, no fingerprints, no stolen goods, just a grainy video of someone in a hoodie, and that's when it hit him. How tall was the suspect? Carlos wasn't exactly tall for his age, 1.63 on a good day. And if the person in the video was taller, what if he could prove that the person wasn't him? He grabbed another book, Techniques of Cross-Examination. It was then that the librarian, Mr. Garcia, a gray-haired man with thick glasses, approached. What is all this? He asked, looking at the stack of books. Just doing some research, Carlos replied. Garcia gave him a long look. Are you in trouble, kid? Carlos hesitated. He could lie, say it was for a project, but something in the old man's gaze made him sigh. Yes. Garcia pulled out the chair in front of him and sat down. Then, you'd better know what you're doing. For the next hour, Carlos explained everything. How he was accused, the plea deal, the lack of evidence. Garcia listened, occasionally nodding. Then he leaned back. You have good instincts, but the court isn't just about facts. It's about how you present them. Carlos nodded, taking notes as Garcia broke down the basics of courtroom strategy. How to make a jury see the truth. How to plant doubt. How to ask the right questions. By the time he left the library, Carlos's notebook was filled with ideas. He was no longer just waiting for justice. He was preparing for battle. But the real test was yet to come, and the courtroom would not be as forgiving as a library. The courtroom smelled of old wood and coffee. Carlos sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped, his heartbeat a constant drum in his chest. His public defender, the same man who barely looked at him in the precinct, sat beside him, flipping through his notes as if he hadn't even read them. On the other side of the room, Sergeant Roy Bennett sat rigidly in his uniform with his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Carlos could see it. The confidence, the certainty. This was not a man who thought he would lose. The judge entered, an older man with silver hair and deep lines on his face. The moment the trial began, Carlos felt it, the weight of expectation. The prosecutor stood up first, a woman in a navy blue suit with a voice as sharp as a razor. She didn't waste any time. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The accused was seen near the crime scene, matching the description given in the images. Sergeant Bennett, a veteran officer with over 20 years of experience, detained him based on probable cause. We believe the case speaks for itself. Carlos gritted his teeth. Probable cause. Those two words had stolen days from his life. The prosecutor turned and walked towards the jury. This case is not complicated. The store was broken into, and stolen goods were taken. And who was seen nearby? The accused, the hoodie, the sneakers, the time. It all adds up. He made it sound so clean, so obvious. Carlos's fingers curled into fists. Then the public defender stood up. Carlos had no idea what he was about to say, but he had no hopes. The lawyer adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and murmured, "My client maintains his innocence. We intend to demonstrate that the evidence does not conclusively prove that he committed this crime. That was it. That was the best he could do." Carlos closed his eyes for half a second, holding back the frustration. He had prepared for this. He wasn't going to sit there and watch them throw him under the bus. Then the judge turned to him. "Mr. Ramirez, I understand that you wish to speak. In your own defense." Carlos breathed. His mother was behind, watching, holding her breath. He stood up. The courtroom fell silent. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was firm. "I do." The judge studied it. "Proceed." Carlos stepped forward, looking at the jury. He had a chance. "Let's talk about the evidence," he said, "or the lack of it." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Carlos pointed to the prosecutor's table. "The security footage, where is it?" The prosecutor moved, then nodded towards a screen. "We were about to present them. The video played. A grainy figure in a hoodie moving quickly. The store window already shattered. The person's face completely hidden." Carlos crossed his arms. "That's it." The prosecutor frowned. "That's you?" Carlos shook his head. "No, I'm not." Silence. He turned towards Jez. "Your Honor, may I ask a question?" The judge nodded. Carlos looked at Sergeant Bennett. "Officer, how tall am I?" Bennett blinked. The question took him by surprise. I don't know. 163. Carlos pointed to the screen. "So, tell me why the store's security camera records say the suspect is 1.75. A pause. A heavy pause. The prosecutor moved. Bennett's jaw tightened. Carlos's pulse was hammering, but this was just the beginning. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that had weight. Carlos held his position, his heart hammering in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had just exposed a huge hole in his case. The suspect in the video was 175 centimeters tall. Carlos was 6'3", and now everyone in that room knew it. The judge leaned forward. "Prosecutor, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "The quality of the footage is poor. It's difficult to make an exact measurement." Carlos shook his head. "Not according to the store's security system." Turned to the jury, his voice firm. "Most modern cameras have a height scale at the entrance. It's designed to measure people during a robbery. The footage they're showing you, that height marker, is right there." Bennett shifted in his seat. He knew. He had to know. The prosecutor sighed. Even if the height isn't exact, the hoodie and the sneakers match. That still places you at the scene. Carlos didn't flinch. He was ready for this. With all due respect, that's not how evidence works. He turned to Bennett. Officer, he checked my shoes when he arrested me. Bennett's fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair. Of course. Carlos nodded, and they were the same shoes the suspect was wearing. Bennett hesitated for just a second, but everyone noticed. The prosecutor cleared her throat. We don't have to prove every detail, Carlos interrupted. Yes, you have to do it. Another wave of murmurs. Carlos wasn't a lawyer, but he had studied the law. He says they have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and right now there are doubts about this whole case. The judge turned to the prosecution. Do you have any direct evidence linking the defendant to the crime? The prosecutor hesitated. The officer believed. The officer believed, Carlos repeated. His voice didn't tremble. He stared intently at Bennett. That's not evidence. It's an assumption, and assumptions ruin lives. The room was tense. Then Carlos took a slow breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, may I present something to the court? The judge nodded. Carlos took a folded piece of paper from his pocket and walked towards the stand. This is a record of Sergeant Bennett's disciplinary reports. The prosecutor's eyes shot up. The judge raised an eyebrow. And where did you get this? Carlos maintained his calm expression. It's public record. The judge took a moment flipping through the pages. The tension in the room shifted. Finally, he looked up. Sergeant Bennett, is it true that you have had multiple complaints filed against you for unjustified arrests? Bennett's jaw tightened. His fingers clenched. That's irrelevant. Carlos turned to the jury. It's irrelevant because I think it matters. I think it matters that the officer accusing me of a crime has been caught doing this before. The prosecutor seemed ready to object, but the judge raised a hand. Carlos felt it. The change, the doubt. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was winning, but the biggest revelation was yet to come. The courtroom felt different. Now the atmosphere had changed. The confidence on the prosecution's side had cracked. The jury no longer looked at Carlos as a suspect. They looked at him as a boy who had been harmed. Sergeant Bennett was visibly tense. His usual air of authority had been stripped away. Carlos could see it. The small changes in his posture, the tight grip on his wrist, the way he avoided eye contact. And then the judge spoke. We will take a short recess before the jury deliberates. He looked towards Bennett. And I want to talk to the prosecution in my office. That was never a good sign. Carlos sat back down, breathing carefully. His mother reached out from the row behind him, squeezing his shoulder. You were brilliant, she whispered. But he wasn't celebrating yet. 20 minutes later, everyone was back in their place. The jury entered. The bailiff called the court to order. The jury foreman stood up. This was it. The judge nodded as the jury reached a verdict. The jury foreman cleared his throat. We have it, Your Honor. He looked directly at Carlos. Regarding the charge of theft, we find the accused Carlos Ramirez not guilty. A wave of relief flooded Carlos's chest. Elena exhaled sharply behind him, her hands pressed together in silent prayer. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned towards the prosecutor. After reviewing the evidence and the new information presented, I am instructing the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Sergeant Bennett's conduct. A wave of shock spread through the courtroom. Bennett's face turned red. Your Honor, this is absurd. You should be very careful with what you say next. Officer, the judge interrupted, his voice firm, because this court has seen enough today to question whether he should be wearing that badge at all. Silence. Carlos watched as Bennett sat there, trapped in the same way he had been just days ago. But Carlos wasn't the one in handcuffs now. The judge cleared his throat. This trial is over. The gavel fell. It was over. Carlos turned around, and before he could react, Elena wrapped him in a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. But even as relief washed over him, Carlos knew this was no longer just about him. Because if Bennett had done this to him, how many others had they silenced? But Carlos hadn't finished fighting. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, the sky felt bigger, the air lighter. Carlos had entered as the accused. Now he was leaving free. But freedom felt different when you had to fight for it. Reporters gathered near the stairs, cameras flashing, microphones pushed forward. "Carlos, how does it feel to prove your innocence?" someone called. Paused. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder, stabilizing him. He could have said a lot. That he felt relieved, that he felt angry, that he felt tired. Instead, he looked directly at the cameras. "I shouldn't have had to prove my innocence." Silence. Then murmurs. People scribbling in notebooks. The weight of those words settled because that was the truth. Carlos had not only fought against an unjust accusation, he had fought against a system designed to break people like him, and that system was still standing. Elena guided him past the crowd, but before they reached the car, a voice called out, "Hey, kid." Carlos turned around. It was Mr. Garcia, the school librarian. He wasn't alone. Some of Carlos's classmates were by his side, even guys he didn't talk to much. "You did it," Garcia said, nodding. "You made them listen." Carlos swallowed. "Yes, but what about the kids who don't have the opportunity?" Garcia studied him, then blushed. "So maybe it's your job to make sure they have it." Those words stuck with Carlos because it wasn't just about him. In the days that followed, Sergeant Bennett's internal investigation became public. More stories emerged, more names, other boys, other cases. Some had accepted plea deals just to make it stop. Others had lost years of their lives. Carlos had won his case, but the fight wasn't over. He wasn't done. A week later, he entered the school library, a notebook under his arm. Garcia looked, up from his desk. "What is that?" he asked. Carlos put down the notebook. "A list." Garcia raised an eyebrow. "What?" Carlos exhaled. "Every law I've been reading. Every right people need to know. Every trick they use to keep people quiet." Pushed the notebook forward. "I want to help people, guys like me, so that this never happens again to them." Garcia smiled. "Then you'd better get to work." Carlos nodded because he now knew that justice doesn't come easily, but when you fight for it, you make it harder to ignore. And this fight was just beginning. If you believe in standing up for what's right, click the subscribe button. More people need to hear stories like this.